Under cliffs carved out by the elements, the ancient Anasazi built their homes into the mountain, protected by the earth itself. Living in harmony with nature was a question of survival. The people who lived here knew that every meal they ate, every tool they used was a gift from the earth. Today we've lost sight of that connection. We forget the technology itself depends on earth systems and must function within them. At any level of technology, we must ask the question, is this way of life sustainable? For the Anasazi, the answer was no. Without planning, as population increased, basic resources, trees, water, and soil were depleted. In crisis, they had to abandon a land that could no longer support them. And so they moved on and disappeared. Like many cultures that have come and gone, we're still in the habit of using our resources for short-term gains and then moving on. Until now, late in this century. You see, until now, there's always been new terrain, a new river, a new forest, a new part of the globe to track down and map out and develop. But the more important maps are in our heads. And this program is about changing those maps. It's about changing our own personal attitudes about the environment. It's about waste and energy. It's about pollution. And it's about living in harmony with the only world we have. We know where we are on a map of a city, state, or nation, but do we know where we stand within the more complicated network that makes up the living planet? Do we know, for instance, how the loss of biodiversity or the extinction of a species will affect us? What you just saw is how nature works. Every plant, mineral, and animal contributes to the whole. Each plays a part in the larger organism we call Earth. And in the planet's natural cycles, nothing is wasted. Except here. This is the species that attempts to live outside of nature's cycles. This is the species that uses more than it needs. This is the species that wastes. And we waste in greater concentrations than natural processes can remove. When the wastes build up or combine to the point where they begin to threaten life, we call it pollution. At this level of technology, most of the time it has not been a big problem. But technology changes. Now pollution becomes very noticeable, and our pollution has begun to dominate the natural world. It starts to kill it. In 1963, marine biologist Rachel Carson noticed that when spring came, the early mornings were strangely silent, where they had once been filled with the songs of birds. What she uncovered was the connection between a broken bird's egg and the spraying of pesticides. Her book, Silent Spring, changed the mental maps of millions of people.
Traveled around this country, one thing is clear to me above everything else, and that is that the government alone is never going to solve all the problems of the environment. And where we have found real, sustained success is where there are strong citizen organizations.
This was late July of '69. And then when I left Santa Barbara to fly to University of California, Berkeley, to give a conservation speech, I read an article as I flew up on the Vietnam protests that were going on all over the country on the campuses. And they were called Vietnam teach-ins. And as I read that, I thought suddenly, that's it. It's the idea I've been looking for. Let's have a nationwide teach-in on the environment. And it became Earth Day. I went back to Washington and spent the next few months organizing it. And my objective was to get a demonstration so big that the political leaders would have to start paying attention to it, so that the issue would get into the political dialogue of the country, get into the political arena where it had to be if we were really going to do anything about it. It turned out to be even far more successful than I had even hoped for, with 20 million participants and around the nation, 10,000 grade schools and high schools, 2,000 colleges, 1,000 communities. So it did what I was aiming for it to do.
Where the people lead, leaders follow. Between 1970 and today, Congress passed over 10 major environmental statutes designed to clean up the mess we had made, to clean the air and the water, to control toxic chemicals, pesticides, and hazardous wastes, and to protect our biodiversity. We built wastewater treatment facilities. We set air emission standards. For instance, there's 87% less lead in our air today than in 1970. Hundreds of billions of dollars were spent on cleanup activities between 1970 and 1990, and our programs worked. But we didn't quite get the message. Because there's something missing when we try to protect the environment just by making laws to control the pollution we're putting out. Let me show you what I mean. That's pollution. That's pollution control. It's hard, it's messy, can be expensive, sometimes it doesn't work out right, and much of the time retrieval is impossible. Where we want to go, where we have to go, is toward an economy that's in harmony with nature, an economy that imitates nature, that uses up its own waste, an economy that's as creative in reusing as it is in producing. In short, an economy based on the idea of pollution prevention. What's the first step? Changing our mental maps. If we don't generate it in the first place, if we don't put it in the water or the air or the soil, if we don't put it in a garbage can on its way to a landfill, we save raw materials, energy, and tax dollars, not to mention life. Of course, we do have to change our attitudes, our behavior, and our way of looking at the world. That's pollution prevention. And as Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention
is worth a pound of cure. That's the essence of pollution prevention, and all of us must play a role in it. 20 years ago, the environmental movement was different from what it is today. In those first years, we saw the problems, but could only guess at the solutions. Along the way, we've learned a lot about how to get things done. This confidence in our ability to solve environmental problems is just as important as the progress we've made. Our growing confidence will help us manage tomorrow's problems. Problems like global climate change, which is so much more complex than installing pollution control equipment at an industrial plant. There are other changes too. The EPA was founded in 1970. 20 years is a coming of age. I think we're beginning to outgrow the we-they mentality so typical of those early days.
Back in 1970, during the almost a year or 9-10 months that I spent on this Earth Day project, not a single corporation in this country approached me to say they would like to participate. I think that it was a non-issue to them. I think that they didn't really understand, as neither did lots of others, that this was didn't think it was an important issue. And so they didn't participate. And all the legislation that was proposed all the way through the 70s, every single economic interest group in industry that was affected by the proposals for Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, hazardous waste dumps, groundwater pollution, ocean, lake, river pollution, any industry affected, vigorously opposed it.
This hands-off attitude prevailed among businessmen from the turn of the century on. For the pioneers of American industry, smoke meant money. The furnaces that fired our factories and mills were symbols of the energy that built America. So it wasn't surprising during the early years of the environmental movement in this country, industry was afraid that what environmentalists really wanted was to shut down the furnaces themselves. Since shutting down the plants was usually out of the question, what we did was add expensive end-of-pipe devices to treat pollution on its way to the environment. Hundreds of billions of dollars were spent on this. Now, these devices work well, but they are expensive to buy, operate, and eventually replace. The future of industry lies in an entirely different direction. Instead of accepting production as inherently dirty, something we have to clean up after, we have to redesign production itself so that it's inherently clean.
We can't continue to spend our capital, which is all of our air, water, soil, forest, minerals, ocean. Pretty soon we run out of capital. If a corporation does that, they go bankrupt.
Companies that refuse to redesign often don't take into account the cost of polluting. If their bottom line reflected not only the cost of materials, equipment, and employees, but also the often hidden cost of polluting byproducts in health, liability, and disposal, they'd find it makes economic sense to invent new production strategies.
When we debate these pollution issues in Congress, we talk about the cost of putting scrubbers on the smokestacks. We talk about the costs of reducing emissions out of tailpipes, but we almost never talk about the healthcare costs, about the costs of crop losses due to acid rain. And government could really help by requiring that those costs are put into the equation when we talk about these issues.
We're going to have a social compact among all the groups, business, industry, agriculture, religion, government, and the general public, and academia. We all have to be aiming at how do we design a environmentally sustainable economy. There is no model in the industrial world. It means we're going to have to make all kinds of changes, but it won't work unless we're all aiming in the same direction.
Industry, particularly some of the larger corporations, are beginning to sit down with members of the environmental community and say, okay, how can we work together? I think we're breaking down the stereotypical images that we have had of each other and are beginning to cautiously work for places where we really can form partnerships and help to solve our environmental problems together. But it's really just at the beginning.
There's more of a tendency now to think about mediated approaches to resolving problems rather than a confrontation in the courts. There are still going to be those confrontations. Don't mistake that. There are going to be some hard issues that cannot be resolved through any other medium except the judicial system. But typically now you get environmentalists talking with company officials, talking with government officials, and trying to work out a consensus approach, a much greater willingness to consider a consensus solution. And I think that's because everybody's given a little bit.
We finally, after 20 years, recognize that the activities of mankind are, in fact, seriously and dangerously degrading the worldwide ecosystem that sustains us. I think everybody recognizes that, and that includes the leaders in industry and in agriculture and in politics from all walks of life. That is a huge change. So now that it is recognized, I think all of those interest groups are prepared to cooperate to address the issue. Nobody's denying it's an issue anymore.
The underlying principle is simple: sustainable growth. We can take no more from the environment in terms of resources than the environment can sustain. The hard question we have to ask ourselves is whether our way of life is purchased at too dear a price. If we are indeed using up our environmental capital at an alarming rate, spending it like income, then we are dissipating our natural assets. We are living in environmental debt.
Well, we're heading into a waste crisis in the United States. We are generating much more of it than we should be or than is necessary. We know that in other successful, competitive, productive countries like Japan and Germany, they generate a third or a half as much as we do. It's not fundamentally necessary to our economy that we generate this waste, or I think that we generate more than 22 tons per capita of carbon dioxide, when many other countries, West Germany, generates under 13. We can do better. And what we need to do is to identify the solutions, but then to help people embrace them in their own lives and in their own ethic.
About 12 years ago, a group of citizens who were interested in the recycling issue and felt that we were throwing away things that were quite usable set up a voluntary program with a variety of people in the community. They created a drop-off center where people could take their recyclables. We're now working with what we call the second generation of recycling in Boulder, and we call it Recycle Boulder. The success of the program has been fantastic. We, from the very beginning, have experienced between 50 and 60% participation in the voluntary program. We're very happy with the results of that. The thing I guess I find most exciting, most impressive about it are the people that I hear from who say, I never would have imagined that I would have participated in recycling, and now they understand that it's really quite easy to separate it in their homes, put it out on the curb once a week, and they have willingly changed their habits. And I think one of the comments we hear often from people is, it's a little thing that they can do, and during this era, I think people are looking more and more as to how they can make a personal commitment to helping resolve some of the environmental problems.
I think the great majority of Americans want to do what is right, what needs to be done. And while it helps to have a financial incentive, as in the case of used beverage cans, I think that the problem is of such proportion today. I think there'd be a large cooperative voluntary recycling effort.
The school system that I was in was using styrofoam trays in the cafeterias, and from what I'd heard about styrofoam, which wasn't much, I thought it was this evil thing and that we had to ban it. So I decided to write a petition to the school committee asking them to switch to cardboard, because I'd always thought that paper was a better thing for the environment than styrofoam. When we started getting information from corporations and samples of products that were alternatives, it really became clear that cardboard wasn't the answer. It would be twice as expensive. You have to cut down trees to produce cardboard. And styrofoam wasn't as bad as it seemed at first. The whole biodegradable issue was a null point, because landfills are now constructed so that things won't biodegrade in them. They're finding newspapers and vegetables and all sorts of things in landfills that haven't biodegraded. And when I submitted the petition, it was sort of a classic thing of attacking an issue before learning about it.
The problem that you articulated wasn't one of polystyrene versus paper. It was really a problem of education.
Right.
What is it that's going to be good for the environment, and how can we best implement those things?
I couldn't even believe that you could recycle styrofoam. It just doesn't seem like, it wasn't in my mind as being a recyclable thing, and everything's recyclable, really, and it's just a matter of...
That's a very important point. Everything is recyclable. We just got to figure out the best way to do it, how to collect it, and if we can, eliminate it from the waste stream to begin with, but if we can't, then we must recycle it.
As of last year, 55% of the aluminum cans sold in the United States were recycled, and that's a growing percentage every year. Aluminum has sufficient intrinsic value to allow you to pay an attractive price for it, because it takes a great deal of capital investment and cash to convert a pound of bauxite into a pound of aluminum. And recycling aluminum saves 95% of the energy required to make a pound of primary, virgin aluminum. Anything that's made of aluminum, I don't care if it's foil or pots and pans or whatever, we can use it and we'll pay a good price for it. The trick will be to find an economic use for the recycled materials. And that's what we're trying to solve in the case of plastics. And we think we can solve it.
We're such a small part of the plastic consumption in the United States that we cannot be the total answer. we are very good at educating the public, and we think by our demonstration that plastics can be recycled, others will come along. And as these centers get set up as pilot programs and as demonstration projects, then you're going to start seeing plastic from other sources being recycled. Soda pop bottles, milk cartons, egg cartons, and things of that nature. So I look at McDonald's, the litter asks the question, what is McDonald's going to do? Our answer is, we think we can recycle this plastic. So we're going to set up demonstration projects, prove it, as you did with your school and your styrofoam trays, and now we have a demonstration project that says clearly plastics can be recycled. So now let's everybody join hands and let's get it out of industry, let's get it out of restaurants, let's get it out of the home, let's use egg cartons and milk cartons and soda pop cartons and all these different plastic bottles, and let's recycle it all.
And make it easy for people. Curbside recycling is a classic example. It's so easy to do. I mean, you put out your trash, and next to it you put your bin with your recyclables in it, and it's just a matter of making it comfortable for people, and they'll do it.
If we get creative, recycling of industrial and consumer waste can go far beyond curbside programs and recycling centers.
In 1989, 35 million Christmas trees were bought by Americans. If all these trees were taken to the landfill, they would do nothing but take up needed space. In fact, half of the landfills within the United States are expected to close within 10 years. And why? Because they will be filled to capacity. In response to the problem, I found out about a program that recycles their Christmas trees and turns it into usable mulch. Christmas trees that are taken to the landfill aren't used for anything but taking up needed space, whereas trees that are chipped can be turned into mulch and returned to the soil.
We can certainly solve the landfill problems by cutting way, way back. I don't know if there's an ultimate solution to the landfill problem unless everything was recycled 100%. And that probably isn't likely. But we certainly can cut way down on the problem. We can probably cut it by 80% if we did our ultimate best at recycling.
Industry is moving forward on recycling across the board with processes we don't even get to see.
Our customers have approached us to see if we could develop a recycled paper, and we're working on this both in North America as well as Europe. The demand for recycled paper right now really is not known. There's a lot of interest and a lot of emotion, of course, about recycling paper with the focus on the environment in the 90s. But really, how much is going to be used, what the final impact will be, remains to be seen.
This process, pioneered by InCycle, recovers metals from liquid waste that were once disposed of into the environment. Using this technology, it is possible to mine metal out of wastewater instead of mining new ores from the earth.
I think we have to get every company producing something to be concerned about the ultimate disposal of what they produce. And they need to actively pursue solving the problems of the ultimate disposal.
It used to be 5 years ago even, if you talked about an environmental crime, you'd get an incredulous look and response. Nobody thought about violations of environmental laws as being criminal in nature. That's totally changed now, and the penalties have reached up into corporate boardrooms, into the senior management suites, to hold senior corporate decision makers accountable for the actions of their company. That's not likely to change.
People don't like to see bad things about their companies on the front page of the newspapers. They don't like to see it on the evening news. They're going to make changes because on one hand, the changes are right in their own self-interest, and on the other hand, they don't like to have their company portrayed as environmentally bad during a time when environmentalism and people's concern about the survival of the earth has never been higher than it is today.
Progress at any price isn't progress at all. Now, for those of us in the industrial world, the message becomes quite clear. Environmental safeguards have to come before production, before profits. We can't shrug off the problems caused by pollution. We certainly can't ignore them. It's a totally unacceptable way of doing business because it can seal the fate of life as we know it.
I think multinational corporations have a role of setting the example. We have a role of utilizing the best production and manufacturing techniques that are available to us worldwide and globally, and also utilizing the best pollution prevention and emission reduction techniques that are available to us globally.
In our assessment of our facilities after Bhopal, we found several cases where we were unhappy with the potential outcome. It caused us to review how our operations were safeguarded at all locations around the world, and we made an extensive assessment, found that even though we had the latest state-of-the-art in place, we were not happy with the prospect of risk that might be associated with it, and we made a number of changes on how we were operating so that we had what we thought was a satisfactory risk level.
I think GE, like most industries, are going to be spending more money in basic research and development in the area of pollution prevention, hazardous waste, remedial action. GE in 1990 will spend over $10 million in basic research in this arena, and I think most companies will be doing that. I think the result of that is you will see new technology applied both to prevention and to remediation. As that technology evolves, we'll be finding new ways of substituting materials, we're finding new ways of doing remediation, and we'll find out new information about toxicity.
If I have to stand up there and talk about spills, that's a lot more incentive for me to communicate back to the people in the plant that there should not be any spills. It's one thing to just report them and go through the motions. It's another thing to talk to the people in the neighborhood who are very concerned about those sorts of things. You get a lot of extra incentive in terms of coming back and saying, look, we have got to stop spills. We have to reduce our spill frequency. We've got to improve because the people in the neighborhood expect it.
We needed some way to communicate with the community, communicate with the people who lived around our facilities. And we thought the Community Advisory Council would be a forum where we could tell people about what we were doing. They could ask questions, they could investigate. The questions they asked were very much to the point of what we were doing in the community, what we were doing about pollution, what we were doing about odors, and they were right on point and on scale.
Let's face it, we rely on millions of products and don't think much about where they come from. All products, no matter how high-tech, are Earth-based, but behind them are manufacturing processes that can generate lots of pollution. We aren't going to give up these products. What we need to do is take another look at our production practices and find better ways to make these products.
When we used to ship product, for example, into the consumer product area, we would wrap it in plastic bags in order to keep the dust away from it. We would pack it in plastic foam and overpack it with cardboard. But if you re-look at that situation to see how much we throw away of all of that, which was enormous, and sit your engineers down and say, now your new design philosophy is to minimize all of that. It's amazing what some of these people can come up with.
But can we, in fact, redesign production so that it is inherently clean? The answer is yes. New plants like the one built by Saturn Corporation in Spring Hill, Tennessee, start with this idea. From the outset, environmental protection and natural resource conservation guided the plant's design. Because of this, the plant produces 1/5 of the wastewater generated by similar facilities. It's even exploring the possibility of creating its own wetlands to treat the wastewater. That project would reuse up to 100 million gallons a year to spray irrigate crops. But it's rare to be able to build a new factory from the ground up. What are we going to do about upgrading the vast majority of American plants, the ones that we've already got?
We're at the Kodak Park site in Rochester, which is Kodak's major manufacturing complex for the manufacture of photographic films, papers, and chemicals. In the roll coating division and in cellulose acetate manufacturing, we use refrigeration and carbon absorption to reduce emissions to the atmosphere. Over the past 40 years, we have used these systems to recover and reclaim over 96% of the methylene chloride used in those operations. Beyond that, the company committed to a 70% reduction in emissions of methylene chloride by mid-1995. This would translate to increasing our reuse and recycling of methylene chloride from 96% to over 99% in that same time frame.
Intel perceived early on that it needed to take action to make sure we were reducing the amount of byproducts and hazardous materials that we were creating as waste from our operation. In 1985, we embarked upon a major program to reduce the amount of hazardous waste that we needed to ship off-site for treatment or disposal. In 1985, we were producing about 5,000 tons. By 1989, we had reduced that to 600 tons. That's almost a 90% reduction. In that same period, we about doubled our revenue. So we were increasing in the size of the corporation and yet substantially decreasing the amount of pollution that we were generating.
Anybody who uses halogenated solvents has problems, both environmentally and from an industrial hygiene standpoint with the employees. And the best thing to do is to really face it head on. Go out to look to see if you have any problems of this nature. Investigate it environmentally and look for alternatives to the halogenated solvents. We did this in 2 instances where we had the use of such solvents. We developed a material called delimonene as a degreasing material, as well as citric acid and water as another agent. By developing this process, we were able to avoid the generation of about 1.5 million pounds per year of waste solvent and emissions to the air of the order of 500,000 pounds per year.
We are beginning to use our tools in an environmentally responsible way. Tomorrow, we'll be able to do even better.
One of the tools that we often use to translate a laboratory process to a full-scale production design is a computer simulation. One of the computer programs that we have developed at Merck for this purpose provides us with an environmental assessment.
And this is the information that will be passed on to another computer program that will analyze this output in order to find out what are the environmental impacts of this process.
We have information available at our fingertips. We know now where companies that are polluting. It's now published by the government. Anybody in their own home can hook into that information on a computer.
One of the most effective ways we've found of wrestling with pollution prevention is to deal with the entire process. Start with suppliers, work the whole manufacturing process through, and wrestle with customers in terms of how the product is going to be used. Now, if you deal with the total process as opposed to discrete elements of the process, I think you're going to be more effective in the long run.
That it's important to us that our solvent customers respond and react appropriately with respect to environmental protection. And that means many times that we teach them how to use our solvents more effectively. We teach them how to implement waste reduction projects in their own facilities so that they use less of our solvents. And at first look, you might say, well, that doesn't seem to make much business sense. But I think we believe anyway that those customers are going to appreciate that knowledge that they gain from us. They're going to appreciate the fact that they have reduced emissions. And ultimately, we believe that's going to make them better customers.
As we finally phase out our existing plants, what are we going to do with them?
When Monsanto began closing its chemical plant in Columbia, Tennessee in 1986, naturalists pointed out that it included one of the only existing nesting sites for great white egrets. The company made 200 acres of wetlands adjoining the site available to the community for a wildlife observation area.
Well, it's always been our policy here to maintain, try to maintain some kind of wildlife habitat or enhance wildlife habitat where we could.
Individual effort is the key to making real changes, but we have to think the issues through clearly. People make the difference. People like the ones you've just met.
It's essential that in the future, that the true cost of doing business, the cost of environmental degradation, the cost of natural resource depletion are entered in to the business decision-making process. Only then will we have an accurate way of determining the true cost of business and will allow us to look into the future and take a more sustainable view.
And the thing about moving towards a pollution prevention type of approach is that you're moving towards creating non-polluting products that are made by non-polluting processes. And that basically means that you're not producing waste anymore. And not producing waste, in my mind, is the fastest way to get to high quality and low cost. So I think pollution prevention and global competitiveness are going to go together in the 90s and beyond. And I think forward-looking companies are going to go that route. They are going to move toward having factories that don't pollute, basically don't create waste, and towards products that don't create waste, either in use by a consumer or in use by an industrial customer.
Executives can steer a company in the right direction, but it's the employees that come up with ideas and make pollution prevention work. A growing number of companies have developed creative new programs to get their employees involved.
RAP's really a very simple program. RAP is focused on encouraging, rewarding, and recognizing people and facilities who do a good job in the area of waste reduction. One of our primary goals with RAP is to encourage and create what we refer to as a waste reduction mentality, looking really at waste as an opportunity, not looking at waste as a necessary evil, but really as an opportunity. And we think that's the challenge.
Well, our project was team-oriented. We have about 25 personnel in this building. We all got together and had a group discussion and decided what projects were the most viable and which ones we could do the easiest. And then we just strove towards that goal, and we reached our goal rather quickly that way as a group.
We could not have accomplished our results that we've seen without the involvement of all of our employees.
Every employee in the corporation has a role to play in the SMART program.
They used to dispose of 150 to 200 gallons a year, sometimes a great deal more depending on the projects underway. And with this one piece of glass, the waste produced in the last working year, which has been fairly busy, was roughly 2 cups full. So we've gone from 200 gallons to 2 cups.
The real success of the SMART program thus far has come from little ideas, not big ones.
The 3P program has been successful. As I mentioned, we've completed almost 2,500 projects that both prevented pollution and saved money over a 15-year period. Those 2,500 projects have prevented approximately 500,000 tons of various kinds of pollution. But they've also saved the company $480 million, which is a lot of money.
What industry has to do, I think, is develop a social conscience that they have to be a part of the solution. They have to come to the table with pieces of the solution in hand, rather than being dragged, kicking and screaming to the table, which is historically how it has been.
Although there's been lots of resistance in the last 2 or 3 decades, finally I think the word is coming through, and we are being heard not just by the different administrations throughout the world and the representative of industries, but mostly by the public, which has now taken into their own hands their own destiny.
1 or 2 or 3 or 4 companies is only the tip of the iceberg. We've got to move a lot farther and a lot faster than we're moving right now if we're going to save this planet.
Now we need to roll our sleeves and become ambassadors and spread the word and go out there and provide solutions. It has to be the decade of solutions.
One of the most important challenges before the business community today is to develop strategies that take a longer view, but the pressures for short-term profits is enormous. Quarterly profit statements, hostile takeovers, shareholders demanding more profits for the shares they buy, the number of shares traded daily. But if we're going to have an environmentally sustainable future, then business leaders must look at the longer view and not just short-term profits.
How can we test long-term impact? What may appear to be a miracle product in the short term, like CFCs for instance, can pose vast unknown threats to the world's climate cycles or food chain.
Here was a material that was invented decades ago, which was a beautiful material. It was stable, it was non-toxic, it was non-flammable, it had extremely fine properties for use for refrigerants, for blowing agents, for aerosols, and in our industry, heavily for solvents. As a matter of fact, we paid more for the material years ago in order to get out of use of more toxic solvents. And now, later on, to our amazement, we find that this is the same material that is despoiling the ozone layer in the stratosphere.
And inevitably, efforts to control pollution in one media frequently result in shifting that pollution to another media. We do have to look at it from a global perspective.
One of the exciting prospects for 1990 is the formation of the Industrial Cooperative for Ozone Layer Protection. And what we have in mind is to place on the table a library of things that work. This is technical information that is in the public domain that we're making available to small companies in the United States who don't have the technical resources that we do, and also to other nations, the emerging countries that don't have the infrastructure to support CFC elimination. And through this, we'll provide the technical data that shows them how.
Because the companies that are producing CFCs in this instance came forward and said, look, we want to phase out by a date certain our production of all CFCs, you've got environmentalists and government stepping back a little bit and saying, well, we're not going to jump in with a regulatory program demanding the halt to production right now. We're willing to put up with a phase-out approach. I think this is a positive way of addressing some environmental issues. In some cases, it's not. In some cases, you're going to have to say no.
I think most corporations haven't even started. A few of the larger corporations that have the resources to experiment with change are really making significant progress. But we've got to significantly reduce the toxics we're putting into the air and the water and our land. We've got to go to integrated pest management and reduce the amount of chemicals in our food. We've got to get those smokestacks cleaned up, and all of this is possible.
I think the phase-out of lead, this was a discussion that went on for a very long time, the use of leaded gasoline. And Bill Riley, when he came into office at EPA, said, the time for studying, the time for considering this issue is over. It's been proven conclusively that lead has a major human health impact, and we've got to stop it, and announced an immediate phase-out because there were available substitutes for leaded gasoline.
When we use cars, the big issues are air pollution and energy conservation. Back in the 60s, people thought that 2-ton chrome-plated, tail-finned models like these were just what everybody needed, that Americans would never move into anything different. Just goes to show how attitudes have changed.
In 1970, the only pollution control device on a typical car like this 1970 Nova was the PCV valve. What this does is it recycles the crankcase emissions back through the engine of the car. This was invented at GM and was given to the rest of the industry and was fairly easily accepted. The next parts of the pollution control story are more difficult. And that's where I came into the picture, because I was the first catalyst expert in GM, and our next step was to put catalytic converters on all cars. But this was a very difficult step because previously cars had been the domain of mechanical engineers, and now we're going to put this chemical device on this mechanical product. And nobody believed that this was going to work in those early days. They used to call me Captain Catalyst and laugh a lot about that. But today, we've got 100 million of these things out there on cars just in the US fleet. And it looks like everybody else in the world is going to copy this essentially American development. This was a very difficult time, not only for the auto industry to make a change like this, but it also involved the oil industry because the catalyst doesn't work if there's lead in the fuel. So we had to get the oil industry to take lead out of the fuel. This was the time of the oil crisis. We were also downsizing our cars taken lots of weight out of the cars. We have today twice as much aluminum in our cars as we did in 1970. You should know also that the car is perhaps the most highly recycled product in the American market. All these metal parts are essentially made from recycled metals. The next step involves the plastics. We have a lot of plastics in the cars today, and we're trying very hard to find ways to recycle all this plastic, and we have to do that. The next step, however, in the pollution control story was the computer that was put in all the cars in 1981, so that today cars run a lot better than they did in 1970. They go about twice as far on a gallon of gas as they did in 1970. And most importantly, the amount of pollution has been reduced somewhere between 95 and 96%. In other words, that 1970 Nova puts out more pollution than do 26 of our 1990 cars.
Figuring out how cars can become more environmentally sound involves more than just the big car companies. It involves how cars are serviced and maintained as well.
I recycle automotive refrigerant, better known as Freon. I also recycle radiator antifreeze, which has the potential for serious groundwater contamination. Most other shops don't participate in any programs or utilize any special equipment to take care of these potential toxic pollutants. It's unavoidable to completely stop using all toxic solvents and chemicals. And I do generate my fair share of these products here. And I choose companies that close the loop on this generation as far as their responsible disposal.
You make the decisions. Where you get your car repaired, what kind of car you buy. Cars like this experimental GM electric car are going to be a part of our future. Right now, these cars are not available, so we need to look at our current fuel systems and begin to take alternative fuels seriously.
We're looking at the possibility of fuels other than petroleum-derived fuels, and the one that seems to have the most support is methanol. Now, there are groups out there working on all of these possibilities, both at GM and in the fuel industry and elsewhere. But methanol offers some really exciting possibilities, because not only can we reduce the pollution from the tailpipe of the cars, but if we make the methanol from renewable sources such as paper or garbage or trees, then we're closing the cycle and solving the greenhouse or global warming effect as it relates to cars.
There are other novel ways to beat pollution. One is by staying home and getting paid to do it. AT&T recently decided to figure out how much pollution would be prevented if some of their employees telecommuted to work 1 day a week. Telecommuting is when you work at home and phone in your work using computers and fax machines. They found out that in a city like Los Angeles, telecommuting actually could save a lot of pollution, and it's pleasant too. Alternative fuels require consumer interest and support, and the same goes for alternative transportation systems and alternative energies, such as solar and wind power.
It's important to recognize that the renewable energy that is supplied by the sun, solar energy, wind energy, is an infinite resource. Very little of our government funding is focused on how do we more efficiently capture this infinite resource. Significant funds are being expended understanding how to more efficiently use the natural resources within the earth. So it's a question of infinite above the earth or finite energy within the earth. Wind energy in the United States has only just begun in California. There are many states, particularly in the West and along the Appalachian Mountains, where the wind resource is available. The turbines could be economic, and we believe that over the next decade, many of these areas will be developed. For each kilowatt hour that this wind plant produces, it avoids the necessity of burning fossil fuels that contribute about 1 to 2 pounds per kilowatt hour of pollution to the environment. So what you see here today is a wind plant that really occupies only about 3% of the land space, with the remaining land left available for agricultural use, either in grazing of livestock or in dry farming, grain farming particularly.
What we are getting at again is sustainable development. What is the point of high crop yields one year if the soil is depleted and drenched in pesticides as a result? We must start looking at sustainable methods, and we must look carefully and critically at long-range bioengineering in agriculture.
Well, there's a whole cross-section of different types of farmers that are out there. There are farmers that rely heavily upon chemicals, and then there are farmers that try to integrate biological techniques with chemical techniques, and then there are farmers like myself that do not use any of the traditionally known common toxic chemicals. A normal chemical farmer would probably have to spray a field anywhere between 4 and 5 times with a toxic type chemical. This entire ranch has not seen a single pound of commercial fertilizers since 1971. And there are many parts of the ranch that have never seen commercial fertilizers. And this ranch has also never seen herbicides in the vineyards. We have an awful lot of people that work here with us on the farm, and I don't feel that there's the kinds of risks that would be happening on, let's say, farms where you have to wear goggles and masks and gas masks. And so my daughter can run and frolic throughout this field without any kind of worry that she may be, eating something that's poisonous. Our grapes here have to be competitive with chemically grown grapes, and we can't just go out and grow something that isn't competitive in the marketplace. We've been able to figure out enough of the details of what nature does to solve these problems to make it work.
Climate change, global warming, is coming upon us very rapidly. When almost 100 Nobel laureates send a letter to the president saying this is really a serious problem and we've got to address it, I think it's pretty credible that global warming is a very serious problem. And in order to help industry to move farther, faster, to address this problem, I think we've got to have tax incentives. We've got to have pollution prevention tax incentives.
As employers and employees, as consumers, as citizens, as parents, each of us can act. Pollution prevention is everybody's job. The question is, will we be role models for our kids, or will they be role models for us?
And by the year 2000, we're going to have only about 3,200 landfills all around the United States to put our garbage. So as we're increasing our garbage, we're decreasing the places that we can put our garbage safely. And we're using up our resources far, far too much today. How many of you are collecting bottles and containers at home? Oh, that's great. I think we should give ourselves a big hand. How about you?
It's been a fun project for us, but I think a major part of it has to really be devoted to the kids. They're not only our future, but they're our today. And if we can teach them how to prevent pollution, if we can teach them how to look after our environment, conserve our natural resources far better than you and I did, then we can indeed have a major impact in conserving this earth that we live in. We're committed to doing that as a company, and we must be committed, we think, as a society. These kids hold so much potential for our accomplishing that. We've got to help them do that. I think they're committed to helping us do it.
As a wise man once said, there's only one important question in life: what to do next. What will tomorrow's solutions look like? To a great extent, that depends on you. I don't think, for instance, that tomorrow's solutions will look like this. These documents are the permits issued under federal laws for just one chemical plant. It took 20 years to write them, millions of dollars to research them and argue them in court. These permits are strongly enforced and can be made more stringent as time goes on. But in the bigger picture, they are only a starting point. These permits will tell this plant how much pollution it can emit, and in some cases, how it has to treat the pollution it does generate. What they don't say is what chemicals to make or how to make them. That is up to the company and to the marketplace. There are penalties here for violating the permits, but there are no incentives for cleaning up beyond the permit levels. Permits like these the core of our environmental protection system permit millions of tons of toxic, harmful chemicals to be released into the environment every year. But consensus and our emerging pollution prevention initiative is changing this.
Consider this. If the oceans, sky, trees, rivers, and other species could speak, what would they tell us? And can we begin to take the time to listen? When nature returns our pollution to us, in our air, in our water, in our food, do we hear the message that we're out of harmony? Would we exploit nature less, both in advertising and in fact, if we respected nature more? How can we begin to change our everyday habits? How can we learn to look at each consumer purchase and each business choice with new eyes? More simply, let's not just think of nature as 2 weeks of vacation a year. Our first step, every morning when you wake up, picture a clean environment. And next, let's see what we can do together to realize this.